Shabbat Shalom. So, one of my wife's favorite movies is Dr. Zhivago, which, if you've ever seen, it's a wonderfully long, depressing Russian story. And like all good Russian stories, well, not that they're ever good, but they're always miserable, but like all Russian stories of great detail and length, again, I don't think I've ever read a short Russian story. I guess it's something they do for the winters. The names of the characters are impossible to keep straight, because everybody has like 3 or 4 different names as they are called by mutual friends, by people higher than them, as children under them, as the nicknames. I am so glad that she made me watch it rather than read it. Because if I had had to keep track of all the different names for every character, I don't think I could have made it. It was hard enough just knowing about who people were talking about when they were off screen. If I hadn't had the picture of their face, it would have been impossible. Thankfully, in Judaism and the story of the Torah, the names are simple, right? Adam, Chava, boom, we're done, right? Very stable. Even when we get to Avram, he gets a change to Avraham. Very, very simple to follow, and it becomes consistent. Until Yakov, until Jacob. Jacob is a curveball. Jacob is called Jacob when he is born. And then when he wrestles with something, lots of debate in the commentaries of whether it was man or angel, on his way back into the land of Israel and to encounter his brother, he is renamed as Israel, Yisrael, right? That is kind of an important word for us. But he doesn't only get called Yisrael from that point forward. Abraham becomes Abraham after being Avram from when he was born, and when he becomes Avraham, it's done. He is never referred to as Avram again. Same with Sarai becoming Sarah. Once they switch, they're done. But Yakov seems to bounce back and forth. And you might say, well, maybe the family knew him as Yakov, and so the nickname just was still there. Maybe Israel didn't really catch on, or maybe he had an official name and a casual name. Except God doesn't seem to be consistent. In this week's Torah portion, the section that we read out loud, God calls out to him as he is about to head down towards Egypt. And what does he call him? Yakov, Yakov. And Yakov answers, Hineni, right? So good. Jacob is still answering the call of God. Many argue that this is in fact the first call of God he has had since Joseph left. Otherwise, why didn't God tell him his son was alive? But why does God call him Yakov? Why not call him Yisrael, the name that seemingly came from God? If anything is going to refer to him by that name, you would expect that to be God. And yet God seems to take a step back and use his old name. Commentators, of course, are not silent on this. So they chime in. On the one hand, they point out, it's very simple. Jacob was born to a nice Jewish family. Let's say Jewish, proto-Jewish. But they named him Yakov. And therefore, if he was to only ever be called Yisrael again, it would imply there was something wrong with the name Yakov that he had been given as a child. That maybe that was not a good Jewish name. The way that Avram indeed was named as such by idolaters, to be called Avraham would make a break from the past. But Yaakov didn't have to make a break from the past. There was nothing wrong with the way his parents raised him. Yitzchak and Rivka, they raised him to worship God. He was not an idolater. Therefore, his name had no stigma attached to it from the past. Or did it? Say other commentators. Perhaps if he had stuck only with Yisrael, people might have thought that he was hiding from his original name, Yaakov, which, although it could mean the ankle from which he was grabbing Esau when he was born, can also be interpreted, indeed is, in a bitter form by his brother, as meaning deceptive and cunning. And therefore, if he avoided that name in the rest of his adulthood, perhaps he would be saying there might be some truth to that, and he doesn't want to give that impression. So using both names continues to make sense. Personally, I prefer the interpretation of Ramban, Nachmanides, who argues that God is using Yaakov instead of Yisrael at this point because it is providing a bookend for this part of his life. He was Yaakov when he lived in the land of his father-in-law, of Lavan, where he worked to have his family be built. And as he came back into the land, as he was about to enter into the land of Canaan, his true inheritance, that was when he wrestled and became Yisrael. And what is he about to do now? Leave the land. He is exiting. In the land you are Yisrael. Outside of the land you are Yaakov. You are going into exile, says Ramban. Now, that may sound a little harsh. It's one thing to say he's taking a vacation, but are we really going to call this exile? That he is going into exile from the land of Israel, the land of Canaan? Well, says many of our commentators, yes. This is the physical manifestation and fulfillment of the promise, the warning that was given to Avraham those many years before, that his children would go into a foreign land and there they would be subjugated. That's the definition of exile if you talk to me. Except, is Yaakov and are his children about to be subjugated in the land of Egypt? Are they about to become slaves? No. They're going down in the lap of luxury. Right? They're about to be the royal shepherds, which I guess is kind of an important thing. They are going down to live under the protection of Joseph, who is number 2 in the entire country. You don't get further from being a slave than that. So why call this exile? Well, I believe that Ramban had this particularly in mind because he was somebody who knew exile too well. He was somebody who lived during the time of the expulsion from Spain. He was somebody who saw the effect upon his community and upon the entire Jewish world of what exile would look like. And he could reflect that going into exile doesn't always mean you go in chains. Going into exile is a state of mind, a state of being. And there is exile, there is slavery in comfort, just as there is exile and slavery when you are in bondage. And the exile that happened for Yaakov and his family, it was an exile of comfort. It was an exile that took them away, not just from the physical land of Egypt, but took them away from Israel, but from the concept of Israel, from the concept of God. Think for a moment of what it was like for them to live in the land of Egypt. They settled in nicely. They settled into the wonderful upscale district of Goshen. There's lots of good houses available. They move in, they bring their wealth, they are prosperous. But what kind of country are they living in? What are the main characteristics of Egypt at this time? It is a tyranny. Right? We know that from our previous parshiot. We know that from what comes next, that all of Egypt becomes beholden to Pharaoh as a tyrant in a way that they had not been before. Do the children of Jacob object? No, they're okay with that. No problem there. We know that the entire world becomes under the oppression of the Egyptian empire, the world as they knew it at that time. As the Egyptian armies would extend up in through the land of Israel and beyond and out across North Africa. Did our people object? No, it's okay. We were doing fine. No problem here. Our time in Egypt made us casually familiar with idolatry. It made us casually familiar with the creature comforts that living in one of the greatest empires in the world at that time could offer. We had all of the good and bounty that was traded up and down the Nile. We had consistent and reliable food that was being provided by the ever predictable cycle of the Nile's flood, something that could not be said for life in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And we got used to it. We got so used to it that even when there was no longer a famine, which was only going to be another 5 years, remember, we stayed put. We were willing to put up with the idolatry. We were willing to put up with the corruption. We were willing to put up with the oppression of others because it was nice. And Ramban saw the same thing. Nachmanides saw the same thing in our time in Spain. We put up with the different corruption and oppression and barbarism that came from both parts of Muslim Spain as well as the rising Christian Spain when they had the reconquest of the peninsula. And we went along with it. Why? Because our communities were thriving, our communities were wealthy, the art, the literature, the ability to do business, this was incredibly advanced in that area. And so things are a little bit worse today than they were yesterday. So some people are fighting a war. No, what does that have to do with us? We can stay, our communities, they're set, they're stable, they're good. Why should we be involved? Okay, they put a new restriction. Okay, they put another new restriction. All right, now things are getting a little bit difficult, but moving is going to be even harder. Okay, now they're actually burning us at the stake. It is amazing how quickly you move from one stage to the other, and amazing how easy it is to ignore it until those final moments when you realize how bad it is about to get. And so too for our ancestors in Egypt. They thought that things were fine. They thought they had an understanding with the Egyptians. They thought everything would be as good as it had been when Joseph was alive. But how does the book of Exodus begin? There arose a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Joseph brings his family into exile. It is necessary, it is absolutely essential at that moment because of the famine. The family must be reunited to become who they are going to be. But to be too comfortable in that exile, to allow ourselves to ignore the warning signs around us, to allow ourselves to be comfortable even while others are being hurt by the system that is treating us adequately. This is the problem of the exile of Egypt and the exile of Spain and the exile of many other times in our history. It starts off with a welcome hand. It starts off with an open door. It starts off even with words of praise and support. Time and time again, Jews were welcomed into countries, only to later be put under harsh restrictions or expelled in even worse conditions. But it shouldn't come as a surprise, not because of anti-Semitism. That, yes, is a given. But it shouldn't come as a surprise because time and time again, the countries we were invited into and where we were made to feel comfortable were busy oppressing others. And if you are living in a place where you feel comfortable and someone else is suffering, you are not contributing to the path of redemption. And that is the Jewish cause. God did not give us the Torah just so that we could live in a small portion of the world and feel comfortable and safe while others suffered. God gave us the Torah so that we could be a light that would show that suffering was against God's will for this world. And we should not be able to feel comfortable while others are not. And yet, time and time again in our history, we have chosen to keep our head down, to enjoy what we have, to not rock the boat, to not draw attention to ourselves, to live in a comfortable exile while still allowing redemption to be delayed because of the abuse of those around us that we were afraid to confront. Redemption will only come, and a full end of every exile in this world, the alienation of so many from what is good and what is beautiful that God has offered to give to all. When we recognize that, yes, we can be comfortable, but we can never be complacent. It is fine to live in a life that gives you comfort and security, provided you recognize that that is not universal, and that you have an obligation to help those who have yet to make it into that state, and a definite obligation to protect that as well, not only for yourselves, but for all. Because ultimately the lesson that we have learned throughout history is that if we are in comfort when others suffer, the cycle of suffering will eventually return that to us as well. Shabbat Shalom.